right, listener, ready for a head trip? We're going deep on Curry's paradox today.
Using an excerpt from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, no less.
Exactly, and you know what really gets me about this one, this paradox? It finds a way to twist logic without even using the word not.
You're right. It's fascinating how Curry's paradox creates a logical contradiction without relying on negation.
Unlike some other famous paradoxes we've talked about.
Like the liar paradox.
Yeah, or Russell's paradox.
It's almost like Curry's paradox found this, backdoor into logic, this way to create a contradiction without even saying not.
So how does it do that?
Well, the key is in how it uses implication. The Stanford Encyclopedia starts with a really clever informal argument to show this.
Okay, let's hear it.
Huh?
I'm always up for a good mental workout.
So imagine someone says, if this sentence I'm speaking is true, then time is infinite.
Whoa. Okay,
Yeah.
so they're talking about the sentence itself and then using that to say something about time.
Exactly. That's a Curry sentence in action.
All right, but how can just saying a sentence, even a self-referential one, make us have to accept that time goes on forever? That seems like a stretch.
It does seem counterintuitive, which is precisely why it's a paradox.
Yeah.
The argument basically uses the sentence's own content to create a kind of logical loop.
A loop. So where does the loop start?
It starts by assuming the sentence is true, hypothetically, of course.
Okay.
And then it shows that if we assume that we can actually derive the sentence's consequent logically.
The consequent being the claim about time being infinite.
Right. But the thing is, the if-then statement we end up with is basically the sentence itself.
So we're proving the sentence is true by assuming it's already true.
In a way, yes. And that's the heart of the paradox.
Yeah.
The argument shows that the sentence is true if and only if it's true, which is kind of a does statement.
Right, it's tautology.
But because of that, we can conclude that the sentence must be true and therefore time is infinite.
It feels a bit like we're pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps.
Yeah. I see what you mean. And what's even wilder is this line of reasoning isn't limited to just claims about time. You can swap out time is infinite with any claim, even something obviously false, and the argument would still hold.
Wait, so you could prove that, the Earth is flat using this structure?
Yep. Or that I can fly. You name it.
That's where things start to get really weird for me.
So you're saying we could have a proof for anything, even if it's total nonsense?
Exactly. That's the real head-scratcher with Curry's paradox. It exposes a kind of vulnerability in logic, a way that self-reference can be used to create these seemingly valid arguments for any conclusion.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see why philosophers get so worked up about this. But the Stanford Encyclopedia doesn't just stop at these informal examples, right?
No, they go deeper into the more formal side of Curry's sentences.
Okay, I'm ready for the deep dive. How do they define these sentences more rigorously?
They define a Curry sentence as any sentence that's equivalent to a conditional statement where the antecedent is the sentence itself. So it's still that same self-referential structure, but just expressed in a more abstract way.
Precisely. And the problem is these Curry sentences can cause a lot of trouble within formal systems. They can lead to what's called triviality.
Triviality. That doesn't sound too good.
It's not. A trivial theory basically becomes useless because you can use it to prove anything, whether it's actually true or false.
So it's like the theory loses its grip on reality.
Exactly. It can't tell the difference between what's true and what's not anymore.
So if we have a theory that allows for a sentence that says, if I'm true, then anything goes, that theory is basically doomed.
Pretty much. It collapses under the weight of its own contradictions.
That's heavy stuff. So how do they actually construct these troublemaker sentences, these Curry sentences?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia outlines 2 different methods for creating them, both of which take advantage of this power of self-reference.
2 methods. All right, lay them on me.
The first method draws inspiration from Russell's paradox.
The one about the set of all sets that don't contain themselves.
That's the one. But instead of sets, we're talking about properties here. For example, imagine a property that's defined as, this property applies to all properties that exemplify themselves only if time is infinite.
Okay, so we're talking about a property that refers to itself and then brings in a consequence about time being infinite.
Right, and as you can probably guess, this leads to a contradiction.
Because if the property applies to itself, then time has to be infinite.
Exactly. But if it doesn't apply to itself, then it must apply to itself, which again means time is infinite. It's a classic paradoxical loop.
So the first method uses properties to build these Curry sentences. What about the second method?
The second method uses sentences themselves within a theory of truth. It's similar to semantic paradoxes, like Grelling's paradox.
So back to sentences talking about themselves.
Right, like a sentence that says, this sentence is true only if time is infinite.
Okay, I see the self-reference there.
Mm.
And I'm guessing this sentence also leads to a paradox.
Absolutely. If you try to add this sentence to a theory of truth, you end up with a Curry paradox. The sentence's truth gets tangled up with the truth of its consequent, leading to a logical contradiction.
So both methods, even though they use different tools, ultimately exploit self-reference to create these paradoxical Curry sentences.
You gotta, self-reference is the common thread tying all these logical knots together.
Okay, so we've seen how these Curry sentences are built, but how do they actually lead to a paradoxical conclusion? What are the steps involved?
The Stanford Encyclopedia dives into that too. They analyze what's called the Curry paradox lemma, which lays out the steps for deriving that paradoxical conclusion.
Okay, a lemma. What's that exactly?
It's basically like a mini theorem that highlights the key logical principles driving the paradox.
Gotcha. What are those principles?
Two of the most important ones are modus ponens, which we've already touched on, and a principle called contraction.
Modus ponens, I get that one. If A, then B, and A, therefore B, what about contraction?
Contraction essentially lets us take a statement that implies itself and conclude that the statement itself must be true.
Can you give an example?
Sure. So if we have a statement like, if this statement is true, then time is infinite. Contraction lets us jump directly to, this statement is true. And from there, we conclude time is infinite.
It seems like contraction is the real troublemaker here.
Yeah.
It allows us to go from a hypothetical statement to asserting its truth.
Exactly. And that's a crucial step in the paradoxical chain of reasoning.
Okay, so we've got these two principles, modus ponens and contraction, working together to derive the paradox. But I'm assuming philosophers haven't just sat back and let this paradox wreak havoc, right?
Of course not. The article goes on to explain how different attempts to resolve Curry's paradox often target specific steps in this derivation.
Like trying to disarm those logical bombs.
Exactly. Some solutions might try to challenge modus ponens, while others might focus on diffusing contraction.
That's where things are going to get really interesting. I'm dying to hear how philosophers have wrestled with this mind-bending paradox.
Yeah, we're about to get into some serious philosophical debates.
But before we go there, I think it's a good time to take a breather. We've covered a lot of ground already in this deep dive.
I agree. It's probably a good idea to let all this sink in for a bit.
Listener, we'll be back soon to continue our exploration of Curry's paradox. Stay tuned because we're just getting started.
Back again. Ready for more Curry's paradox.
Bring it on. My brain's all warmed up from our last session.
Good. Because now we're getting into how philosophers have tried to tackle this paradox.
Yeah. How do you even begin to untangle a logical knot like this?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia does a great job of categorizing the different responses.
Okay, so what are the main categories?
They talk about two main camps, the Curry incompleteness responses and the Curry completeness responses.
Okay, those sound pretty technical. What's the basic idea behind each one?
The main difference is how they approach the problem of triviality. Remember that meltdown that Curry sentences can cause?
Yeah, where the theory becomes useless because it can prove anything.
Right. Well, the Curry incompleteness responses see triviality as a big no-no, and they try to modify the theories themselves to prevent those paradoxical sentences from even showing up.
So it's like they're trying to build a wall to keep those Curry sentences out.
Exactly. They're fortifying the theories to make them immune to those logical grenades.
Makes sense. What about the Curry completeness responses? What's their strategy?
They're a bit more radical. They don't want to change the theories themselves. Instead, they suggest that the problem lies with the logic we're using.
Whoa, so they're saying the rules of logic themselves need an overhaul.
In a way, yes. They argue that classical logic, the kind we usually use, might be too powerful when it comes to self-referential statements.
It's like those statements are exploiting a loophole in the system.
Exactly. And the Curry completeness responses want to close that loophole by adjusting the rules of the game.
So we've got one side trying to strengthen the theories, and the other side trying to rewrite the rule book of logic. This is getting really interesting.
It is. Curry's paradox really pushes us to rethink some fundamental stuff about how logic works.
Okay, so let's start with the Curry incompleteness responses. How do they try to modify the theories to avoid those paradoxical sentences?
The Stanford Encyclopedia mentions a bunch of strategies, like Tarski's hierarchy of languages, the revision theory of truth, and contextualist approaches.
Okay, I've heard of Tarski's hierarchy, but I need a refresher. How does that work again?
Tarski's idea was to create a hierarchy of languages where each level can talk about the truth of sentences in the level below, but not about its own truth.
So it's like a ladder where each rung can only look down but not up?
Exactly, and that prevents those self-referential Curry sentences from popping up because a sentence can't talk about its own truth in this system.
Clever. It's like they're saying, if self-reference is the problem, let's just make it impossible for sentences to refer to themselves.
Right, it's all about avoiding that circularity that leads to the paradox.
Okay, so that's Tarski. What about the revision theory of truth? How does that one work?
Revision theory sees truth as a process of constant change and refinement. We start with some initial ideas about what's true, and then we update those beliefs as we get new information.
So it's like truth is always evolving, never fixed.
Exactly. And this helps to deal with paradoxes like Curry's. Instead of seeing a Curry sentence as a fatal contradiction, revision theory sees it as a claim that needs to be adjusted.
So it's more about managing the paradox than eliminating it.
Right. Revision theory gives us a way to deal with those inconsistencies without throwing out the whole system.
Okay, and what about those contextualist approaches?
Contextualists emphasize the role of context in determining the meaning and truth of sentences. They argue that a sentence like, "This sentence is true only if time is infinite," might be true in some contexts, but not in others.
So it's like saying the meaning of a sentence can change depending on where and how it's used.
Precisely. And this flexibility allows them to diffuse the paradox. For example, in some contexts, a Curry sentence might be considered meaningless.
So it's like saying, hey, the sentence is only a problem in certain situations, and we can always find a situation where it's harmless.
Exactly. Contextualism provides a way to handle those tricky sentences without having to completely rewrite the rules of logic.
All right, so those are some of the strategies in the Curry incompleteness camp. They're all about modifying the theories to avoid those problematic sentences. But now, let's switch gears and talk about the Curry completeness responses. What's their approach?
Remember, they're the ones who want to change the logic itself. They argue that the problem isn't with the theories, but with the tools we're using to reason about them.
Okay, so they're saying we need to upgrade our logical toolkit.
Exactly. And most of these responses focus on two key principles that are crucial for deriving Curry's paradox modus ponens and contraction.
Right. Those were the two big players in that Curry paradox lemma we talked about.
Exactly. And within the Curry completeness camp, there are two main strategies for blocking that paradoxical derivation: contraction-free responses and detachment-free responses.
Okay, break those down for me. Starting with the contraction-free responses, what's their strategy?
As the name suggests, they want to reject or restrict the principle of contraction. They argue that while modus ponens is a perfectly valid rule, contraction is the real troublemaker when we're dealing with self-referential statements.
So keep modus ponens, but ditch contraction.
That's the basic idea. And there are actually two types of contraction-free responses: strong and weak.
More categories. This is getting complex.
It is, but it's also what makes this paradox so fascinating.
Okay.
It forces us to really examine the nuances of logic.
Okay, so what's the difference between strong and weak contraction-free responses?
The difference is in how they target contraction. Strongly contraction-free responses reject a generalized version of modus ponens called MP.
MP prime, what's that?
It's a version of modus ponens that allows for multiple premises. These responses argue that MPs is too strong and can lead to paradoxes when combined with self-reference.
So they're saying we need a more limited version of modus ponens.
Exactly. One that doesn't give so much power to self-referential statements.
Okay, that's the strong version. What about the weak contraction-free responses?
Instead of changing modus ponens, they focus on rejecting a principle called CP, which stands for conditional proof.
Conditional proof. Remind me how that works again.
It's a way of deriving a conditional statement like, if A, then B, by assuming A and then showing that B follows logically.
Right. It's like saying, if this is true, then that must also be true.
Exactly. And the weakly contraction-free responses argue that CP, while valid in many cases, becomes problematic when we have self-referential statements.
So they're saying we need to be more careful with conditional proof in those situations.
Right. They propose ways to restrict CP so that it doesn't lead to those paradoxical derivations.
Okay, so we've got two flavors of contraction-free responses, strong and weak.
Yeah.
But wait, there's another category, right? The detachment-free responses.
You're right. We've only covered half of the Curry completeness responses.
So what about the detachment-free responses? How are they different?
They're kind of the opposite of the contraction-free responses. They actually keep contraction but reject modus ponens.
Hold on a minute. Didn't we just say that modus ponens was the good guy and contraction was the problem? Now we're switching roles.
I know it seems counterintuitive, but that's the beauty of Curry's paradox. It forces us to question even our most basic assumptions about logic.
Okay, so how do these detachment-free responses justify rejecting modus ponens?
They argue that despite its intuitive appeal, modus ponens might be the real culprit behind the paradox.
So they're saying we need to find a way to reason without relying on modus ponens.
In a way, yes. And just like with the contraction-free responses, there are two types of detachment-free approaches, strong and weak.
Of course there are. Okay, what's the difference this time?
Strongly detachment-free responses reject a principle called CCP, which stands for converse conditional proof.
Converse conditional proof. How does that relate to regular conditional proof?
It's basically the reverse. It says that if A then B is true, then B must follow from A.
So it's like detaching the consequence from the antecedent.
Exactly. And the strongly detachment meta responses say that this principle CCP can lead to paradoxes when combined with self-referential statements. So they reject it altogether.
Okay, and what about the weakly detachment-free responses? What do they reject?
They reject the principle of transitivity.
Transitivity. Like, if A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, then A is bigger than C.
Exactly. But in logic, it means that if A implies B and B implies C, then A implies C.
So it's about chaining inferences together.
Right. And the weakly detachment-free responses argue that this chaining can be problematic when we have self-referential statements.
So they're saying transitivity is fine in most cases, but we need to be careful with it when self-reference is involved.
Exactly. They propose ways to restrict transitivity so that it doesn't lead to those paradoxical conclusions.
Wow, this is a lot to keep track of. We've got the Curry incompleteness responses trying to fortify the theories, and then we've got the Curry completeness responses, which are all about revising the rules of logic. And within the Curry completeness camp, we've got the contraction-free and the detachment-free responses, each with their own strong and weak versions.
It's a whole landscape of philosophical approaches, all trying to grapple with this one mind-bending paradox.
It really shows how much depth there is to logic. It's not just about applying simple rules, it's about understanding the very foundations of reasoning.
Exactly. And Curry's paradox forces us to really think critically about those foundations.
Okay, well, I think we need another break to process all of this. This is heavy stuff.
I agree. Let's give our listeners a chance to digest all this information before we move on to the next part.
All right, we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Curry's paradox. We've seen how these self-referential sentences can really mess with logic, and we've even explored some of the ways philosophers have tried to resolve those contradictions.
It's been a wild ride through the world of logic, hasn't it? We've had to question some pretty fundamental assumptions about truth and reasoning.
Yeah, for sure. And just when I thought we'd covered all the angles you mentioned, this whole other layer of the paradox, something called validity Curry or V Curry.
Ah, yes, V. Curry. It's a fascinating development that really takes the paradox to a whole new level. It focuses specifically on the idea of logical consequence or validity.
Okay, I'm ready to go down this rabbit hole.
Hmm.
What makes V Curry so special? How is it different from the regular Curry paradox we've been talking about?
V. Curry essentially forces a theory to look in the mirror and judge its own judgments. It involves Curry sentences that directly question whether certain statements are valid according to the theory's own rules.
So it's like saying, hey, theory, can you apply your own standards of logic to yourself?
Exactly. And as you might imagine, this leads to some pretty strange results.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of strange results are we talking about?
The Stanford Encyclopedia talks about two main ways this V. Curry paradox can show up.
All right, let's hear them.
The first way involves what's called a consequence connective. It's basically a symbol that represents the theory's own concept of implication. It's like saying, this implies that according to the rules of this very theory.
So it's like embedding the theory's own logic into the sentence itself.
Precisely. And if we treat this connective like a regular implication, and if the theory accepts modus ponens and contraction, we run straight into a Curry paradox.
Because now the theory is trapped by its own logic.
Exactly. And this is especially problematic for those weakly contraction-free responses that try to get rid of conditional proof.
Because conditional proof is basically baked into this consequence connective, right?
Hmm.
If B really follows from A, according to the theory, then the theory has to accept A implies B using that special connective.
Right. It's hard to see how you could reject conditional proof in this case.
So V. Curry throws a wrench in the plans of those weakly contraction-free folks. What about the detachment-free responses? Do they have a way out?
Not really. Remember, they try to block Curry's paradox by rejecting modus ponens, but rejecting modus ponens for this consequence connective is a tough pill to swallow.
Because it's like saying the theory can't even trust its own judgments about what falls from what.
Exactly. If the theory says A implies B, is valid using its own special connective, and it accepts A, it seems crazy to say that B doesn't follow.
Yeah, I see the problem. So vCurry creates problems for both the contraction-free and the detachment-free responses. It's like a double whammy.
It is. It really narrows down the options for resolving the paradox.
Okay, so that's the first form of vCurry with the consequence connective. What about the second form?
The second form uses something called a validity predicate. It's usually written as val, and it takes two sentences as input. It basically says that the first sentence implies the second sentence according to the theory's rules.
So instead of special connective, we now have a predicate that directly expresses the theory's idea of logical consequence.
Right. And just like with the consequence connective, this validity predicate can lead to a Curry paradox.
How so?
It happens when we combine this val predicate with two principles that seem pretty natural given its role in representing logical consequence.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are these two principles?
The first is called validity detachment. It says that if a theory claims that A implies B is valid and it accepts A, then it should also accept B.
So it's like modus ponens, but for this validity predicate.
Exactly. The second principle is called validity proof. It says that if B really does follow from A according to the theory, then the theory should have a sentence saying that A implies B is valid using the val predicate.
That also makes sense. If the theory recognizes a valid implication, it should be able to express that explicitly.
Right. But the problem is that if we combine these two principles with a self-referential sentence involving the val predicate, we get a Curry paradox.
So this validity predicate is just as susceptible to those self-referential loops as the consequence connective.
Exactly. And it creates the same headaches for the weakly contraction-free and detachment-free responses.
Because rejecting conditional proof or modus ponens for this predicate seems just as problematic as rejecting them for the consequence connective.
Right. Seems like we're hitting a wall.
So where do we go from here? Is there any way out of this V-Curry maze?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia suggests that V-Curry might be pushing us towards more radical solutions. Maybe we need to explore logics that go beyond classical logic.
Like what?
They mention substructural logics as a possible way to deal with these V-Curry paradoxes. These logics give us a more fine-grained control over logical consequence. We can distinguish between different types of implications and control how information flows in a way that might help us avoid those paradoxical loops.
So it's like saying, if our current tools aren't working, let's invent some new ones.
Exactly. Maybe substructural logics can give us the flexibility we need to handle the complexities of self-reference without falling prey to Curry's paradox.
Wow, this has been quite a journey. We started with a simple self-referential sentence and ended up questioning the very foundations of logic.
It's amazing how much depth there is to this paradox. It really makes you appreciate the complexities of reasoning and the challenges of formalizing our intuitions about truth and validity.
Absolutely. It's been a real eye-opener, and it's not over yet. The debate about Curry's paradox, and especially this V-Curry variation, is still ongoing. There's so much more to explore.
It's a reminder that logic is a living, breathing field full of open questions and exciting new discoveries.
Well said. And listener, if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this logical gymnastics, don't worry. The important thing is to appreciate the power of these paradoxes. They challenge us to think critically about the nature of logic and the limits of our own reasoning.
They show us that even our most fundamental assumptions about how the world works can be questioned and revised.
And who knows, maybe one of you listening will be the one to finally solve Curry's paradox, to find that elegant solution that reconciles self-reference with logical consistency.
It's a challenge worth pursuing. And until next time, keep those minds sharp and stay curious. The world of logic is full of surprises waiting to be uncovered.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Curry's paradox. See you next time.